Hi, this is Paul. I want to make a video about Doug Wilson and Skye Jethani. And some of you will be like, well, Doug Wilson I have loved and Skye Jethani I hate. And some of you will be Skye Jethani I loved and Doug Wilson I hate. And some of you don't know who either of them are, but this is going to get a little bit into the Civil War and evangelicalism. I'm going to start with Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson is an interesting guy. He's written a bunch of books. He has his own little outfit in Moscow, Idaho. If you just do a little Bing search, because why not use Bing sometimes? Give Bing a little love instead of Google. Doug Wilson Believes, a collection of Moscow, Idaho. Let's see. Women need to be led by men. That slavery wasn't that bad. The bunch of people pay attention to Doug Wilson out there. Black family was its strongest under slavery, women, COVID, that kind of thing. What else can we learn about Doug? Smearing of Doug Wilson. For those who don't know Doug Wilson, he's a faithful, wise Christian, a theologian, pastor. Crooks and liars. Doug Wilson takes over an Idaho college town. Doug Wilson's domineering evangelical church is built on fundamentally misogynistic worldview that permits male members to rape their wives and threatens any woman who objects. Wow. So there was a big profile, deep profile by Sarah Stankorb at Vice. Let's see. Inside the church that preaches wives need to be led with a firm hand. Wow. So, yeah, not a man who shrinks from controversy. He's 68 years old, married to one woman, Nancy, has one son, has Logos School, Association of Classical and Christian Schools, an organization, has Canon Press, a whole bunch of things. This video...
If the Overton window is to be moved back in a more sane
let's watch it on YouTube and not through Bing.
direction, it is going.
Okay. Now, for all of that, I caught this video of his, which I found quite interesting. And a friend of mine said, this is the sense-making of a cult. And it may very well be. Because Doug Wilson is a sort of I should say something else about Doug Wilson, because it's another piece of his story. If you go to YouTube and you search Doug Wilson, Christopher Hitchens, you'll get a lot of very interesting debates between Doug Wilson and Christopher Hitchens. I guess this is a big video that he did 10 years ago. Let's listen to some of that.
Yesterday, Christopher Hitchens passed away, went to meet the Lord, see the Lord, and our condolences go out to those family members and friends, people who are close to him. Our condolences and prayers are with them. In the aftermath of his death, with him being such an outspoken atheist, I thought I would just say something very quickly about that. I wrote an extended set of reflections on his passing that were posted this morning at Christianity Today on their website. And so, if someone wants to pursue more extended reflections on this, I'd refer you to that. But I'd like to say two things about that. Two responses.
I don't know if Doug Wilson would be able to get into Christianity Today. That's interesting.
Christians have in situations like this. That I would like to caution against. The first is a very common error that Christians, tender-hearted Christians.
All right, that's enough of that. This is a debate between him and Christopher Hitchens, moderated by Olansky, who's an interesting guy from World Magazine, another conservative evangelical Christian.
Taking all this in the round, and I could say more, it's an excellent thing that there's absolutely no reason to believe any of it to be true.
Okay, Doug, are you a thinking person, or are you left speechless by Chris's assault?
I give up.
Christopher. Would you mind calling me Christopher? I'm sorry, it's only because it's my name.
All right.
Thank you.
Here's, I think, is the central difficulty of Christopher's critique of the Christian faith. You notice that he's not critiquing the Christian faith by appealing to a standard that overarches all human beings and that is obligatory for all of us. When he says things like substitutionary atonement is immoral, well, by what standard? Who says?
So they did quite a few debates. They became good friends. Very interesting guy. So then this video I caught, and I found it quite interesting. I'd play part of it, and then I want to go look at Skye Jethani and just do a little compare and contrast, because even though I don't believe Skye is mentioned in this video, he's very much part of how Doug Wilson sort of lays out the land.
If the Overton window is to be moved back in a more sane direction, it is going to have to be done by someone very disreputable indeed.
Now, right off the bat, I mean, these videos are very well done, and I imagine that these are scripted. These videos are very well done. They're very effective, and this is about moving the Overton window. So, of course, well, there's his objective, and he just says it right out front. We're going to move the Overton window for the honor of God and the glory of and the good of the world. Let's say, I would imagine that would be it. And even the even the name of his channel here, Blog and May Blog. It's very clever.
Introduction. One of the things I learned from the late Gary North was the threefold division regarding different kinds of religion. There were, according to his taxonomy, these three: power religion, escape religion, and dominion religion. This grid can be applied to all religions, which means that it can also be applied to the evangelical subsets that exist within the broader religious realm. Evangelicals also divide up neatly into these three categories, but before we get to that, we need to survey the current state of affairs. This is because the three evangelical subsets can best be evaluated against the backdrop of the prevailing faith of our culture, which would be power monkeys. The dominant religion of our day is most emphatically a power religion. They are after control, nothing but control, and with no remainder. You, the people, are a saddled horse, and they are standing by, booted, spurred, and ready to ride. They want to control everything. They've claimed authority over how much water comes out of your shower head. They want to control whether your car will start or not. They want to be able to...
So he's framing this basically in sort of a classic American sense of liberty versus tyranny, let's say.
to define any and all dissent as hate speech. No lovers of liberty here. No sons of liberty will be welcome in the suffocating world they are building. Having rejected the bedrock faith that lay beneath America's founding, that faith being an evangelical Calvinism, this means that our elites have abandoned a belief in a predestining God. They have not abandoned a belief in predestination, however, for they still believe in that. Ardently, they believe in that. Whenever divine predestination goes, some people like to assume that it will somehow be replaced with fluffy marshmallow clouds, bendy bright rainbows, unicorns, and free will for everybody. But when a sovereign God goes, these are the kind of Johnnies who immediately see a job opening. They want to replace the sovereignty of God with the sovereignty of man, and by quote-unquote man, they mean some men, and by quote-unquote some men, they mean them. I mean, they want to build smart toilets so they can monitor your poo. That way, if you've been eating way too many fatty foods, something can be done about you as a pressing social problem. Quote, that boy over on Maple Avenue needs to have his social credit score lowered. That's the backdrop. That is the current climate.
So he's very clearly located himself in terms of the social cultural conversation here. That's beyond, and I don't know if he writes his own scripts. I would imagine he does. Very potent, punchy, pretty powerful.
And if that is the current climate, then the pressing need of the hour is a different sort of climate change. But not all evangelicals think so. 3 kinds of evangelicals. So my interest in this post has to do with these 3 categories: power, escape, dominion, as they apply to professing evangelical believers. I divide them up this way. First, those believers who have a yen for power may be called friends of the regime. They do not make claims of control over your life directly, but they certainly want to be on the good side of those who do. They want to be fully cooperative with them, believing that helping the tyrants forge your chains should be called something like, quote-unquote, loving your neighbor. These are the pastors and elders who want to assume the very best about the latest contradictory fog bank from the CDC and who assume the very worst about the consciences of their own most faithful parishioners. Second,
Okay, let's pause there and let's talk a little bit about bounded set versus centered set and how that factors into something like this. Okay, so these are the three kinds of religions. And then we can also use this taxonomy for evangelicals. That's his thesis. We've looked at this before. So a bounded set group, let's say we'll have evangelicals. You have, let's say, Christology. You have Scripture. You have Protestantism. You have conversion. All of these things would sort of be the bounded set, the staves by which you can recognize an evangelical. Now remember, the bounded set is in contrast with the center set, where there's sort of a pole here, and you decide whether groups are either moving away or towards the pole. Now, the video begins with him talking about the Overton Window. Well, what's the Overton Window? Overton Window is commonly defined as the spectrum of ideas on public policy and social issues considered acceptable by the general public at a given time. And many of you understand then what he's talking about. And the video begins, well, those who want to move the Overton Window. Now, he's going to make a statement later in this video that I actually found quite gripping because, well, from what position can you move the window? Well, that'll get interesting. Basically, the argument that he's making is that there's a group of evangelicals out there that are just always trying to keep up with the culture. And what that means is that if women's liberation is coming in the 1970s, then the evangelicals will be adopting it in the 1980s. And they're trying to stay up with the culture by chasing the culture wherever the culture wants to go. Those are the power evangelicals because they're basically chasing the power of this world.
Those believers who are keeping their head down until the rapture are seeking a way of escape. Or if dispensational theology is not their bag, this kind of person might retreat into pietism or confessionalism. The pietist wants to keep his own personal nose clean until God sees fit to take him out of this dirty world, and so he wants to escape unnoticed in this world until he can escape unnoticed to a better world. And the escapist confessionalist wants to sit in the red sports car of the historic Reformed tradition, fire that baby up, put the clutch all the way in, all the way to the floor, and together with R. Scott Clark, make vroom vroom noises. And then third, we have those with...
Now again, if you can find the... I'll just point out R. Scott Clark. R. Scott Clark is a professor. Where's he teaching? American Reformed professor. He's got his degree from Westminster. I know him mostly from his Heidelberg blog, which he writes about the Heidelberg Catechism, which is, of course, one of the doctrinal statements of my church. So here, already you've noticed that what we're doing is moving from sort of a bounded set where, well, this person is Reformed, so here are all the staves, to a center set where, well, R. Scott Clark is an escapist. He's in the red sports car of Reformed theology. So in other words, confessionally, he's in the bounded set with Doug Wilson. But in terms of a center set dynamic, he's moving away from, well, obviously, what will be the focus of the Dominion group. Well, what is Dominion? Dominion is another word for kingdom, and these are people that very much want to see Christ's reign realized on earth as it is in heaven. You can see some of the nuances of theological differences, even of people who are basically within the same camp.
The mind for dominion. These are the believers who seek to labor under the grace of God, seeking to have God load those labors up with what I call Deuteronomic blessings in this life and in the life to come, all of Christ. Now
there's a history of struggle within the Reformed tradition within the Dominionists, and they're a part of it, and they've got their own story, and you can very much look this up, and you can find all kinds of things about this. You will regularly find them as the people that certain groups on the political left fear, because these are the really scary Reformed folks. So that's part of the reason why Doug Wilson will be, to give away a little what the video is about, he will be the naughty boy of evangelicalism.
Third group is the historic Reformed position. It was held by John Calvin, Pierre Viret, Martin Butzer, John Knox, the Westminster Divines, Jonathan Edwards, Abraham Kuyper, and quite humbled to be included in such an august listing and not quite sure how I came to be added to it, me. Another pass. In the first category, I would place all professing evangelicals who are woke or semi-woke. These are transformationalists, but they want, wittingly or not, the kind of transformations that are being sought by the commies and the cool kids, the devil and all his minions. They reject transformations that are sought in obedience to the Great Commission, but accept any transformations demanded by the progressive agenda, to which, after the fact, they are willing to attach a Bible verse. They attach Bible verses the way a junior high kid in a Christian school attaches them to his science fair project, long after the research is done. I believe the word I'm
the guy can write.
looking for instead of attaches is festoons. In the second category, I would include all believers who think that, quote-unquote, the world is a place of irremediable evil. Sometimes the mask is on and sometimes off, but nothing can be done about the essential nature of that black world. Because nothing can be done about it, the only thing for outsiders, believers, to do is to figure out how to cope. The most obvious coping mechanism is to hide out, hunker down, and to reapply the words that Jesus gave us, interpreting them as, quote, when they persecute you in one world, flee to the next. Matthew 10:23. In the last category, I'm talking about biblical transformationalists. They believe that the task of the church is to disciple all the nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything that Jesus taught.
Today in the question and answer, I had a question about the Great Commission. There is an example in the Reformed, a very conservative, dominionist Reformed community about the application of the Great Commission. It's right there.
As somebody once said, Matthew 28:18-20. These folks believe that the Christian faith is a religion of world conquest, not to put too fine a point on it, all nations, all tribes, all languages, every thought captive.
You can see why the dominionists scare some people when they talk this way, even though, well, we've got Moscow, Idaho. Next, Boise.
All disciplines, every field of study, every square inch. So the first
Abraham Kuyper. Go to Calvin University and search for that. You'll find every square inch. But Calvin University dominionists? No, they'll be probably the power people, even though they continue to talk about Abraham Kuyper, who he had mentioned.
First category wants the world to be transformed, with that agenda of transformation being established by man. They want to be progressives as long as progress is defined without any reference to a final and authoritative word from God. Thus, in our era, progress is defined in terms that invariably increases the power of the state. The weather is going to kill us all unless we surrender all our rights.
Now, right there, it's very quick and very subtle, but very, okay, so here's the theological position, but he says it's not really theological because this brand of transformationalists are just sort of transforming the world according to what man wants, not God wants. And then suddenly we flipped over into liberty. And so, okay, dominionism, liberty, well, there's going to be some issues with that, but let's keep going. Again, this, as you can see, this guy's very fun to listen to.
To a centralized authority. The second category is made up of people who believe that the world cannot be transformed. Our job is to survive this world, not change it. And the last group believes that the only standard for conservatism and progressivism needs to be the Holy Scriptures. We are conservatives, and what we conserve is the work the Holy Spirit has accomplished in history to date. We are biblical progressives, but what we want to progress toward is the work that the Holy Spirit has in mind for the future of our world.
And again, it's really well written. He's compacted this. He's got it succinctly, and so you can sort of see in some ways that he's he's playing on these words and saying, well, yes, Christianity is in some ways a progressivist religion, but it's progressing towards. Now, I don't know if he's a-mill or even, he might even be post-mill. That would be very interesting. And it's not unusual to have, I'm going to have a little bit of jargon here, Dominionist Reformed people be post-mill because they believe that, yeah, from Moscow, Idaho to Boise, maybe even to Sacramento and then to Denver and then to Washington and London and the rest of the world, we're gonna take this thing.
Some individuals mentioned in a moment sometimes float between categories, but most evangelical teachers can be largely identified with one of these three groups. I will give a few more names as examples in a few minutes.
Now, this isn't a bad thing. Now, let's pause the video here, and I want to go to another video that I listened to this morning that I actually found quite interesting given some of the comments I get from some friends of mine. So we're going to go from Doug Wilson to Skye Jethani. Well, you might say, who is Skye Jethani? Skye Jethani is a very interesting guy. Let's put him into Microsoft Bing and see what we can find. Well, Skye Jethani, look, he gets a. I should Bing myself, see what comes up. Mostly YouTube stuff. A little bit of scrape from the Twitter, but no, Skye gets he's got something from Amazon here. Skye Jethani is an award-winning author and speaker and pastor. He's a co-host of the Phil Vischer podcast, a weekly show that blends culture and theological insights with comical conversation. Little tidbit here. Don't think Burn Power is going to really be down with the cuteness. I mean, this is a little, sorry, Burn, you're my friend, but I think I know what you'd say to all of this, and that's okay. He has been sought after as a consultant for groups facing challenges at the intersection of faith and culture, such as the Lausanne movement, the White House Office of Faith based and neighborhood participation, and Interfaith Youth Corps. Skye is a very interesting biography. He grew up, it might be let's see. While Doug Wilson is in his 60s, Skye is 46 years old. I'll just say what I remember. Before, a number of years ago, I listened quite a bit to Phil Vischer podcast, and he and Skye and Kristen, and really enjoyed them. And Skye basically became a Christian. He wasn't raised in a Christian household. He got a theological education. And yeah, if you listen to him enough, you get a sense of who he is. Very much in that first category of evangelicals that Doug Wilson is talking about. And I know some of you, I'm looking at you, Hank, never stop saying, pointing him out in a certain way. And he's with another guy who is often hated in this evangelical civil war, David French. Now, what's interesting is that while Skye Jethani, he's ordained in the Christian Missionary Alliance denomination, David French is a member of the PCA. The PCA is the same denomination as Tim Keller. It's a conservative denomination that does not ordain women. The PCA, if you listen to the question and answer that I recorded today, I'm recording this on Friday. The PCA has some, having their own turmoil about same-sex sexuality. Well, I don't know if it's every Friday, but quite regularly, Skye has David French on, and they talk about current events. And Doug Wilson would not approve of most of what goes on here. But it's interesting, again, because confessionally, if you look at something like, again, this bounded set dynamic, David French and Doug Wilson would pretty much be in similar Reformed conservative circles. But if you look at center set dynamics, this is where you get the difference between power, someone chasing power, let's say. And I think that's someone chasing the power of the culture, not wanting to be those kinds of Christians like Doug Wilson is. Even R. Scott, I forgot his name already. the Heidelblog guy, who again got his education at Westminster. I mean, these are pretty conservative, reformed folks. The reformed community is really across a pretty broad spectrum. You can find people who are quite progressive, affirming LGBTQ clergy. The Reformed Church of America, in fact, had more of that spectrum within it, which has caused its split recently. So this is what we're talking about now. Even if you get just a little coming on, they have Phil Visser write a little ditty, which Byrne can let me know what he thinks of this.
Back, so glad you're with us. David French, welcome back. So glad you're with us.
Thanks for
This dilemma.
Oh, I didn't hear the
legal
song.
question.
So basically, David French, I believe some of you know him better than I do. He's a veteran. He's a lawyer. He's a Christian pundit. He writes for the Dispatch. And what he does is walk through the trans athlete questions pretty carefully from a legal perspective and actually from a conservative perspective. But again, Doug Wilson will probably see David French in this power category, even again, though in the bounded set reality, he and David French have a fair amount in common. Wanted to play a little bit of this so you could get a taste for it. Skye Jethani is not affirming. He's sort of a moderate on this. Let's see if I can find a good segment.
sort of the counter to my argument.
I mentioned earlier the symbolic role that athletics has played in American history in integrating different minority classes. Jackie Robinson, illustrating for the whole country that a black man can play baseball and alongside white players, and that begins kind of more of the cultural conversation about racial integration. If trans women are banned from these sports, is there a risk that sets back the integration of trans Americans in other parts of society? Or, I mean, legally it may not, as you made the case that there's differently situated thing, but does it create the symbolic message that trans women are not really women and therefore can have a non-fully integrated place in other parts of American society? Even though that wouldn't be legally sanctioned, does it just kind of culturally send that message and create problems?
Listen to the whole thing if you're interested in the topic, because I thought the conversation was really quite good. I thought it was quite well done. There was a ton of nuance. Skye Jethani is understanding not only some of the subtleties about the issue, but also sports with respect to the culture. I mean, it doesn't go quite in as deep as, let's say, Jordan Peterson getting into the symbolism of sports and how sports sort of translates into this. But it's, I thought, again, it was handled quite well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the arguments for that people make for the participation of trans women in women's sports is just that there's a larger cultural symbolism.
Right.
But that's also one of the arguments on the other side as well, which is there's a lot of people who say, wait a minute, if you're going to say trans women are women, I might be willing to say, and I would be happy to say, that if you're talking about firing, say, an insurance agent just because they're trans, or firing somebody who works in a restaurant just because they're trans, I'm very willing to say that is wrong. That's treating another person unfairly. But if you're going to say that there is that trans women and women are exactly the same, and you're going to try to make me say that, I don't agree with that. And the more you push on the sports issue, or, for example, to move it out beyond sports, intimate spaces. And so, for example, we've had reports that Leah Thomas, who apparently, getting into some of the aspects of this are more uncomfortable, apparently still has male genitalia, and has made teammates very uncomfortable, with that. We've seen reports of that. And that they say, wait a minute, you're asking me to essentially consent to a fiction, that there is no meaningful difference between trans women and women. And I don't consent to that. And that's why this issue has more importance in people's minds on both sides than just is this one swimmer destroying, NCAA athletics?
Is this a case where equating LGBT rights with civil rights, racial civil rights, kind of fails us because there's a lot of overlap and similarities, but where they're different, they're really different, and we don't really have a category to put it in? Because I don't think anybody I know would say, "Hey, black and white people are have some fundamental differences, and we should allow those things to be separate and treated differently." Like that, but there are still just scientifically proven biological differences between male bodies and female bodies. That
I thought it was very interesting that he kept going, scientifically proven. There was a woman watching the meet when someone basically asked her, "Well, are you a doctor?" And she says, "I don't need to be a veterinarian to recognize a dog." And wow. But, scientifically proven. Well, this is where you get into, say, Molly Worthen's The Apostles of Reason in terms of Christianity today, neo-evangelicalism, really trying to, okay, well, let's if we're going to engage the culture, we should at least then use the terms of the culture and reason in the way that the culture would understand.
Yeah.
exist, and you put it as agree to a fiction. Similar rhetoric would have been coming out of white supremacists a couple generations ago, that this idea that black people and white people are the same as a fiction, and I refuse to abide by it. But there was no scientific evidence that it wasn't a fiction, right?
None.
So
Again, back to science. It's like, well, that's interesting.
that's
There's
the
all
dilemma
this
we
pseudoscience.
Exactly. There's eugenics and all that nonsense that went on, but there's nothing legitimate. Whereas I would hope any.
But it's of course not. It's of course germane, because when we talk about modernity and the standards have to be not sectarian. That's the whole move from the Renaissance and the Reformation, which is the turn to the book, and then the Enlightenment, the turn away from the book back to empirical public things, that it doesn't matter what race you are. When you drop those spheres from the tower in Italy, they'll land at the same time.
Scientists would agree that there are truly biological chromosomal differences between male and female bodies, and we can't just wave a magic wand legally or culturally and pretend that there aren't.
Yeah.
So what do we do? What's the solution to that legally?
Well, this is a really, really good question. One of the things that I think is really important for us to do is to stop comparing everything to race.
Yes.
Okay. We just need to stop that. The experience in particular of Black Americans, of Native Americans is not the same. It cannot be compared. The difference in slavery and Jim Crow, for example, or the difference in the Trail of Tears and reservations and the hundreds of years of open warfare against Native Americans. I mean, these are different things. And I understand why activists want to make the race comparison, because the instant you can make the race comparison, your case is as strong as it can possibly be, right?
Sure.
Because the race case is the strongest possible case for non-discrimination. And so I understand why people do that, but also at the same time, we can't keep comparing when one thing is not like the other. We strain and we lose credibility when we try to make one thing like the other when it's not. And so that's how you get to some of this really wild language, like instead of pregnant women, pregnant persons, and a lot of people just rebel at that because they say, wait, now there are a category of people who, and I think we see them all online, who quite frankly, they're just obsessed with trans issues, or they're obsessed with trans people. They are vicious and they're cruel, and they seem to go out of their way to be vicious and cruel. I'm not talking about those people. What I'm talking about are people who are of goodwill, who love trans people, who see them as they should, as human beings created in the image of God, who want them to live lives of dignity and respect and in this very pluralistic, diverse republic that we have, but at the same time say, wait a minute, I'm sorry, but there's still irreducible differences between a trans woman and a woman. And if you're going to make me say or try to make me believe that they're not, and conform the law to something that is not biologically accurate, I'm going to resist that.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of where they're at. The second part of the podcast is also quite good. He goes into the question of liberalism, and now he would go into basically what Peterson would call classical liberalism, not the modernist fundamentalist fight, but a posture of classical liberalism. And they both talk about the fact that you have illiberals on the left and the right. And again, I thought it was a nuanced, productive conversation.
Behavior you would see in an authoritarian country, where elections can only have one outcome, and it's the outcome the authoritarian wants. So that's a classic illiberal move. For years, colleges were plagued with speech codes, much less now after a lot of litigation. But there was a point in time, 10 to 15 years ago, Skye, where more than 70% of America's leading universities had speech codes on the books that would suppress speech that the Constitution protects. That was incredibly illiberal. The recent move a few years ago to decrease the amount of due process in campus sexual assault tribunals. Due process is a fundamental value of liberalism. So you can be very, very alarmed by sexual assault on campus, as I am, but you can't, no matter what alarm level you have regarding crime, you can't strip due process. That's a fundamental liberal value. So a lot of tough on crime measures that you see often are illiberal because they will diminish the due process protections that are apply to, every single American or every person within these borders. So the list gets really, really long. And the unifying aspect of illiberalism that I've found is that it is the notion of rights for me and not for thee.
Mm-hmm.
Rights for me and not for thee. And I think the corollary, there's a Christian corollary to the golden rule that I like to talk about, which is I will defend the rights of others that I would like to exercise myself. Would I like to speak? Yes, I'm going to defend the rights of others to speak. Would I covet due process if I'm accused of wrongdoing? Well, then I'm going to defend due process if other people are accused of wrongdoing. And when you think of it like that sort of as a Christian corollary to the golden rule, it helps you understand, I think, what liberalism can be and should be.
Okay, so it's very interesting because both of these podcasts very much come out of an American tradition. And I think it'd be a little bit tougher for Doug Wilson to try to square his dominion posture with this tradition of liberalism, even though, again, you'll hear Doug Wilson talk about liberty. Now, part of what Wilson, I think, is annoyed by with this particular power group, as he sees, is that they can't move the Overton window. And that's the next section in Wilson's video.
The Overton window. The Overton window describes the range of acceptable discourse in any given age, and over time that window moves. In my lifetime, the Overton window has moved sharply and radically to the left. Many Christians have moved right along with it, wishing that it were otherwise and hoping for the day when they might be able to push it back a little bit. Christians in this category are generally pietists of the second category, but they are the kind of unreflecting Christians who, as my friend Jared Longshore once put it, want good neighbors. They think that the pagan world is fundamentally evil, but ought to have the decency to behave decently.
Okay, and this is of course the second group. He's got his Skye Jethani and probably David French, regardless again of their confessional stances, would probably be in the first group that sees them as basically being just sort of having a drag on the continued evolution of the culture to the left. Now, I don't think right and left, they're used to approximate, but the how culture moves is really a lot more complex than that, but we'll leave it there. And then, of course, this second group, the escapist, would say, yeah, we'd like the world to be better, but we're just staying here waiting for Jesus to come. And again, he's not talking dispensationalists. He's talking Reformed folks.
Real paganism doesn't function that way. What Christians in the second category are about to discover is just how influenced by Christianity the world they assumed to be thoroughly pagan was. Real paganism without a vestige of Christian influence is going to be a hellhole. What they do not recognize is that the Overton window cannot be moved from inside the window.
And when he said that, I paused there and thought, I got to think about that. The Overton window can't be moved. And of course, there's a whole series of questions that you might want to ask. Well, in some ways, his little framework goes into the question, is it the job of Christians to move the Overton window? Did Jesus move the Overton window? Well, absolutely. It took centuries, and Jesus should, of course, come into the picture in terms of how Jesus fought a culture war, how Jesus changed the world. Of course, I would get into Tom Holland's book, Dominion. So there's a lot going on here, and it's again, Wilson's very articulate.
Can only be done from outside the window by people who are willing to say things that are outside the range of acceptable discourse. Things that will be thought to be rude, crude, and unattractive by all the respectable people.
Now this gets into, again, one of the questions that I got in the question and answer this morning about Jesus, about how offensive was Jesus, and the answer was very. He was so offensive that the one thing that almost no one can deny about the historical Jesus is that they killed him. And that fact should ask you why. Should force the question in you in terms of why. What about Jesus and what he said and what he did brought on his death? And I think any study of the first century Judean Galilean culture war can pretty quickly show. If you read Kenneth Bailey's Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes and a number of the books that he's written, many of his students, as he was studying the New Testament in the American school in Beirut, remarked that they were quite surprised he didn't die before 3 years because Jesus was that offensive.
If the Overton window is to be moved back in a more sane direction, it is going to have to be done by someone very disreputable indeed. Quote, what counts as winsomeness in any community is determined by that community, not by those looking to be found winsome to them. In blue communities, partisan political preferences proved increasingly non-negotiable. Mark Devine in a must-read article for The Federalist. And thus you see the relentless logic that drives me to continue on in my thankless but assigned role as the naughty boy of evangelicalism. You may not want to do it just yet, but you can thank me later. As I type these words, I'm on an airplane flying back to the Northwest. How much will it affect my
All right, so he is reading from a script, probably a teleprompter.
Final destination if I get up out of my seat and walk southeast toward the back of the plane? Am I really going in a direction that is any different than the other passengers? This is a metaphor for what our collective evangelical leadership has been doing for the last generation or so. They've raised quite a lot of money from many evangelicals in the donor class in order to be able to fulfill their most urgent mission, which has been to walk to the back of the plane. When you get to the binary choice. What sometimes happens, either literally or in a metaphor, is that you have 17 different warlords, all of them shooting at each other. When it happens literally, what you have is a failed state. When it happens metaphorically, what you have is the comments thread for a random YouTube video. When everyone is free simply to opine, the choices are limitless. Nuance abounds. 1,000 viewpoints bloom. There you are, an American tourist in Kiev, sitting at a sidewalk cafe, smoking a pipe, and holding forth on the problems of Eastern Europe, which, in your view, go all the way back to the defenestration of Prague, and perhaps even before that. Your view isn't exactly that of anyone else that you have ever met, and so you're smoothing out the wrinkles of your somewhat rumpled but very sophisticated take. Then the Russians invade. All of a sudden, with a jolt, your world becomes binary. You have to hop into your rental car and decide which direction to drive. Do you take refuge with the Russians, or do you take refuge with the Ukrainians? You might want to take refuge with the cogent sentiments you were just now urging upon your compatriots, but those sentiments, as it turns out, hold no territory. In other words, sometimes you are overtaken by events. Decisions you didn't know you had made just show up at your front door. They barge into the living room of your heart, sit down, and put their muddy boots on your coffee table. Take another metaphor, please. The now thoroughly discredited leadership of the evangelical movement has been our Neville Chamberlain, and our last 2 years of chaos have been Hitler's invasion of Poland. I speak in a dark parable, but the coming leadership of evangelicalism will need to be Churchillian, or we perish. As representing our Neville, I'm speaking of the Tim Kellers and the Russell Moores. There's no need to describe them as wanting the commies to win, as some on the hard right do, but it is certainly the case that they have wanted to be winsome to the commies, and at some point they decided it would be all right to let the commies define what that winsomeness needed to look like.
Now, this in other ways follows, it's interesting, well, it's probably all in my head. Another one of the questions, which was, well, oh, come on, Vanderclay, and people want me to put your stake in the ground and tell us what side you're on. And the question would be, well, what side of what? Because there's something in this video that is deeply right. But is not alone in being right. So Doug Wilson has this, in the words of one of the things, this little town, this little college town in Moscow, Idaho, that he's taken over. And maybe his Moscow will be the new Rome and Putin will be wrong, and it all starts there. And now I want to be very careful with that, because none of us know the future. And one of the most audacious things that you can learn in studying the New Testament is that if you read the book of Revelation, not just after chapter 4 with all what chapters, but if you read chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation, does the letters go through 5? I can't remember off the top of my head. But if you read the letters to the 7 churches, it's an audacious thing that these letters were written with the assumption that the recipients of those letters and their religious heirs would win. Because let's find the book towards the end of the 1st century, and if you want it even somewhere at the beginning of the 2nd, it's still an audacious letter, because there were these tiny little groups that on one hand were having a lot of internal conflict with Jews who did not believe that Jesus rose from the dead or was the Messiah, and were not accepting the transformation of messianism that Jesus performed. And on the other hand, you have the pagan Roman Empire. And they won. So this sets up a really interesting question. How ought we to live? Now, of course, in some ways, the naughty boy of evangelicalism has his little tribe in Moscow, Idaho, that I know very little about. Obviously, there's plenty of controversy, and all you have to do is Google him or Bing him and find out all sorts of things about him, written by friends and foes alike. And as again, my friend sense, well, this is sort of the sense-making of a cult. Yeah, it is. But that weird little group that received the letters to the 7 churches, they changed the world. So I know some people pushed back on my talking about the collapse of Russia and what that was about. Someone might point out that every little group of true believers really believes they're taking over the world, and most of them just disappear into obscurity. That might very well happen with this little group. They are, by all means, sort of a minority on the Reformed playing field, but there they are. And of course, what he's going to do now is just name a bunch of names. And
such men do not believe themselves to be appeasers. They believe they are just being winsome, and they believe that winsomeness can stop or move the Overton window from within that window. But it cannot. That thing is on wheels. But it is never a good idea to let commies define anything. The people moving that window toward totalitarianism have already budgeted for the presence of winsome Christians. They are already factored in. The lines between these groups are not watertight, and some people float between them. Some folks are doctrinally in the second group, but for various reasons make forays or sorties into the world of the third group, like John Piper on life issues or John MacArthur on religious liberty issues. And Al Mohler teaches from the vantage of the third group, but whoever holds sway over hiring and firing at the seminary is enthralled to the first group.
So you see, he's calling. I mean, I just love the boldness of this. You know, he's calling them out and he's pointing them out. And so, okay, we're not going to play any games about letting everybody fill in the blanks in their own mind in some kind of reformed insider ad libs.
One of the great humiliations in all this can be seen in how the Reformed, who should have been in the forefront of cultural leadership in all of this, have abdicated in so many ways. Our doctrinal and historical heritage is all about this kind of thing, and yet our soi-disant generals have not touched the basic issues with a barge pole. And this was not because there was no one around who was able to speak to these issues. There have been. But the big EVA gatekeepers successfully blocked them and kept their shiny events respectable. In the great big conference called evangelicalism, the men who were actually addressing such things capably were relegated to the workshops in the back halls of the convention center. Men like C.R. Wiley, George Grant, Kevin Swanson, Rod Martin, Tom Askell, Andrew Sandlin, Peter Jones, and a number of others.
And of course, I recognized absolutely none of those names.
They were successfully kept well away from the plenaries and the big microphones. Rod Dreher provides good diagnosis like he's in the third group, but his lack of a solid eschatology puts him functionally in the second group.
Okay, so there's the eschatology again. And, you know, my guess is that he would be a postmillennialist, but somebody in the comment section will know.
But Kevin DeYoung is still in a position to do a lot of good. A torrent of content. Around this time, a critic will stand up and say something like, "I see what you're doing with all this, Wilson. You are positioning yourself to be hailed as the next great leader for our time. You want to be Bard, holding the fatal arrow as the dragon Smaug circles overhead. You read too much." No, not really. The leader we all need, our obscure monk from Wittenberg, will usher in a lot of surprises all around, and I assume we will be as surprised as anybody. But I will say this much. When the moment of crisis comes, as I believe it actually has, we want to be in the thick of it. This is why you have seen and will continue to see a torrent of content coming out of Moscow. Evangelicals have a lot of catching up to do, and given how we've let the clock run down, the whole thing will have to now be done as a crash course. And
now I want to jump back into this little video.
Okay, that was awesome. Thanks, guys. And everyone, feel free to have their camera on. We'll pivot to Q&A. And if you have any questions, turn on, put them in the chat. There we go, moving spotlight. So I'll start with the first question. So I'm reading a book right now that's banned everywhere. You can't find it anywhere, this book. It's the Great Awakening versus the Great Reset by Alexander Dugin.
Wow, so we got another Ukrainian-Russian spotting here.
This is his new book. A lot of people had to die to get this book in my hands, so well, thank you for that. So according to Dugin, this book, he sees this thing emerging in the West as the Antichrist. And Russia is his term for the catechin, is a term from the Bible, that the person or thing that resists the Antichrist and needs to be removed in order for the Antichrist to arrive. So I'm sharing this is for a Russian philosopher who apparently has some influence there, is seeing the situation with a heightened religious intensity. And his other book, In the Swarm by Byung-Chul Han, is a really good book. It's related to...
Now, I want to bring this in because, of course, it's not just pastors in Moscow, Idaho, that have ideas about Christ and Antichrist and the way the world needs to go. There's always a lot of that. And, there's the bumper sticker that well-behaved women seldom change history. Well, it's the same of men as well.
Your work, John. And he says the swarm, one defining feature is that it doesn't have spirit, like it doesn't have a spiritual aspect. So regarding the spiritual dimension of this thing, or at least the perceived spiritual dimension, do you see a countervailing egregore emerging that has deep-rooted spiritual beliefs or practices, and you can interpret spiritual however you want here?
I'd love to just quip this real fast. I was just having this conversation with my roommate who is here. The easiest way to answer that question is I'll give a simplified model, and then I'll put something on top of it. Polytheism and monotheism, the evolution, or at least the relationship between both of those. In polytheism, all shrines matter. In monotheism, it's shrine supremacy. So if we take the concept of morality going through this price discovery, or the symbols of morality going through price discovery, when we achieve the cheapest symbol transference possible, which the internet has done.
Now, symbols of reality going through price discovery. And this is where, in a sense, the Skye Jethani, David French are participating in a marketplace where Doug Wilson, he's working on his torrent of content, but where's the price discovery of Doug Wilson? That's an interesting question, because when you put then the price discovery in here, it's hard to know. Now, will Doug Wilson gain? I tend to think not. I think the worldview of Doug Wilson and that moment has passed, even though he certainly has a degree of power and prophetic vision. Is the Overton window moved from the inside? Usually not. Where will it be moved by? Let's not think linearly in terms of left-right. Let's think three-dimensionally in terms of that window, because that's much more of a better perspective. And also that it isn't, of course, just one Overton window. There are many Overton windows, and they're nested within a variety of places.
And morality going through this price discovery, or the symbols of morality going through price discovery. When we achieve the cheapest symbol transference possible, which the internet has done, we end up in an infinite morality scenario where moralities are just falling out of the sky at this point, because the cost of production is near zero. There's no friction. When you have infinite realities, and the symbols that describe reality are infinite moralities, and each symbol in that morality no longer describes reality, the counter reaction will be a very, very strong push towards monotheism.
Or mono-enemyism, meaning that that's the only thing that anyone could agree on, because the cost of morality is so low that no one can agree on anything they're for, right? So let's all agree on who we hate.
What I would say, Peter, is...
And that's not a small comment. Let's all agree on who we hate. And so, again, to be fair to Moscow, Idaho, at least they're trying some things. And the morality cost finding is happening continually in that. And to conservative people of every stripe, there's always an element of conservatism that is deeply right, because it's been tested and tried and it continues to work. But part of the reason that things continue to move is because it is tested, and the elements that no longer work stop working. And that's why you have this search for the pricing of morality.
Agree on anything they're for.
What I would say, Peter, is I almost feel like I want to contemplate the notion, like the very notion of spirituality as it's being referred to. And what I would kind of call in is the notion of being. And the notion that there is something, and by the way, it's literally just the premise, the hypothesis, that there is something about the nature of being itself, that there is an order of being. There is with the phrase I think would be called natural law. There are characteristics of the underlying substrate that are so fundamental that they're invariant under all possible forms of existence. And if that is the case, and I would consider spirituality to be per se precisely the exploration of that kind of thing, then this landscape that Patrick's talking about would actually end up being a discovery on that underlying order. And so that would be it would be more of a hypothesis on faith, which is an interesting implication. You would simply move forward on the premise that this is the case. And then if it is there, then you would discover it. Otherwise, by the way, it'll just be chaos.
Now, this is just such a remarkable conversation because, to the best of my knowledge, formally, these four participants are all atheists. And yet what you see is a new foundation forming for, and they're all quite hesitant with it. But I mean, what Jordan Hall just said here was pretty significant.
I've got two answers to Peter's question. One of them is that this whole concept of an open source religion using egregores or figuring out how to build a better one or that kind of thing is something that, like, me and the folks that I spend time with speaking offline talk about a lot. Going back to even maybe 2015. The other thing, but like,
Now, the reason he says that an open source religion, and this is in some ways, I'm surprised he and John Vervaeke haven't talked, because a religion that's not a religion. Well, how can we come up with a new scientific religion? And again, part of my skepticism of any such project is that you're pursuing it at the wrong level. Because what a religion is finally is that to which you submit and obey and love, all the way back into the ancient sense of the vassal loving the suzerain. So any religion that we cook up in terms of our rational approach will be insufficient. Religions, in many respects, analogous to scientific truth, have to be discovered, and they need to possess us. And of course, that's at the bottom of this.
We don't have the answer, but that's definitely been that's the topic, right? Is like, how do you bring a spiritual layer into this thing?
And part of the reason they pursue it is because they see, oh wow, it's been religions, even what secular people call religions. And I think secularism has to look into a mirror and recognize its own religious qualities. It's always been religions that re-terraform the planet. That's the level that things change. Now, someone could push back, maybe the Game B people, and say, yeah, the cell phone has re-terraformed the planet. The internal combustion engine, the fixation of nitrogen, the whole bunch of things. But in terms of reprogramming the dominant stewards of the planet being us, it's religions that give us our vision of where we want to go and what is good and what is right and what is true.
And the second thing that I would say is that I stumbled into Paul Vanderklay's space recently, and I spent a couple hours talking to him, and so he's thinking.
So I got wind of this conversation because BJ said, "Oh, I mentioned you in this."
About these same kinds of topics from the perspective of a established Christian church, right? And where does Christianity go in this 21st century thing?
And that to me is a real question. And my skepticism with the Orthodox is similarly shared with my skepticism with some of my Reformed brethren that have their little towns. And yeah, I don't think it's leaving Moscow. I doubt it will take Boise.
Because if you want to talk to spiritual people, best people to talk to are religious people, right? And so they're not immune to seeing these kind of patterns too. So I think that those kind of things are likely to emerge, and I feel as if whichever religious group can figure out the tricks that we're all kind of discussing here and figure out how to leverage them the best in the 21st century is going to be tremendously impactful to the overall scheme, because everybody's going to be scrambling for something to hold on to. Right?
And I don't think it's necessarily leverage them. I think it's to ride them, because again, remember that point in The Lord of the Rings when Gandalf tells the Fellowship of the Rings to flee because your swords, you're not going to take on the Balrog with your little bows and arrows. And, here in earlier, you're going to need to create an egregore. And then we're sort of in Pacific Rim land. Watch Jonathan Peugeot's video on Pacific Rim. We're sort of in Pacific Rim land where we're going to construct something. But again, this closed rationalist, it just isn't going to cut it. The modernism is spent. Well, how does one live? Well, people have always lived by faith.
I think the way to actually implement this, particularly for religious groups or faith-based groups, is they need to be able to hijack a portion of the network, meaning that they need to be able to have the rights necessary to set the terms of how the larger network interacts with them. We're seeing like the little movement of this, like in Florida and other places, saying, "Oh, you could only do this here," right? So maybe you have to hijack a state in order to.
That's Doug Wilson's plan: hijack a city, and Moscow now, Boise next.
In order to have the kind of weight necessary to put pressure on the networks to make a conception a carve out.
And I don't think so. I think when you look at how things move, it's much more happening levels above us than someone is sitting down here planning it. And not to say that many plans haven't succeeded, but they all fall. And they don't look like you want them to look like something out of Daniel 7.
And that if you can do that, you can resist the pressure of this absolute chaos, and provide an outlet where you can escape to if there's enough of these places to go to, or that it's a kind of a survival mechanism, because if this chaotic system gets it so wrong, hopefully, or if it locks down into this long night that no one can think beyond these boundaries, it's going to miss the next big thing that we need to solve. And the only place you might find it is in these little pockets of stability, relative stability, but they're localized, maybe virtually
the Benedict option,
localized or state-based.
So the hijacking egregores thing is, and again, this is actually going back to the wider definition of egregore instead of the specific I one that I like to focus on. But the whole hijacking of religions thing has been going on for forever. The Christians did it to the European pagans, but the wokes did it to the Christians too, right? I mean, like most of woke dogma is just Calvinism that's been mapped over with different terminology. And so like the question is, well, can the Christians go in and re-hijack the woke thing back, right? Or can somebody else come in and hijack them? And then the other question, the weird one, is this: is it's a lot easier to
see, and it's not so much a Christian hijacking the woke or a Christian institution hijacking the woke. Wokeism got going partly because of this split in atheism, okay? And the whole point of this video is that it's one layer up, that these are powers and principalities and spirits that are doing this stuff through us. That's the transformational shift in mentality that actually brings people back to religion. It's their need. Now, again, I don't want to downplay ambition. Jordan Peterson's video with, I think it's Robert Greene, about ambition, I really want to give that a little bit more thought. But finally, it's people's need that drives them to worship.
Hijack something that's fixed, because like the train's not accelerating or decelerating. You can just kind of jump onto it and change the name of the boxcars to Saints, right? But if the train is it's four-wheelers driving all over the place, and the Overton window is so all over the map that you have no idea which direction you're going, how do you hijack that thing? And that's a real question mark that I don't know if they're going to be able to figure it out, and if they do, it'll be interesting to watch. But that's kind of where I'm at with that.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about hijacking, I mean, it's like hijacking a corner of this network that's technically disconnected or filtered in a way that protects that.
Did he say corner?
That core group from infiltration, or you create your own bubble of stability. And what we saw with what went on with Trump and his disconnection and his supporters' disconnection is that you can't do it off network. Okay, that if you try to do something off network and run something parallel, unless you're really small, you will suffer damage.
And I think that point, you can't do it off network, it's a vitally important point. And I wouldn't say that Doug Wilson and his team are off network. And quite clearly they're trying to put out as much content as they can.
Have to be able to be connected to the network enough that you could get some of the benefits and features of being on it, because so much of modern life and services are tied to that. But you could protect yourself at the least the social space to have some breathing room, and allowing people to have some kind of control over that seems to be a pretty smart thing to do, at least on a survival basis for us. The voices of dissent, hey, this doesn't make any sense, will come out of those places when they're squeezed out of everywhere else.
Awesome. Maybe we'll squeeze in two more questions. Evan McMullen, you got a question?
Yeah, so I guess I've been thinking, and Jordan, I think you spoke to
this is a great question.
This a little bit earlier, but I wanted to be a little bit more explicit about it. So if we're sort of taking for granted the working definition of egregores are things which run on human brains in much the same way that human consciousness runs on the individual neurons in our brains, then this sort of takes us to a question of, well, what are the analogs here to the sense organs and the specialized sensory neurons that receive sensory input? Because I think this indicates a sort of, if we're viewing egregores as mainly not such a great thing for us as individuals, which seems to be the overall tenor of the conversation so far, we might want to look at these sorts of, well, maybe quite literally blind spots. And so I guess in my current model, I'm thinking that egregores in the terms they've been discussed so far seem to be good at processing information with this sort of virality that we've been talking about, but relatively bad at sensing in the first place. Like what I mean is that they're not directly hooked up to any sort of physical, real sensory organs. And insofar as individual humans and their bodies may function as these sensory organs, well, the sort of sampling function, what the humans think of as salient, is going to be really heavily conditioned by what's already viral within the egregoric network. Okay, so this seems to lead to large chunks of material reality being essentially blind spots for the current egregoric entities, if we want to call them that. And so I guess.
And when I look at, okay, a lot of the little groups, say Moscow, Idaho, most of material reality seems to be blind to them. And this is part of the reason that religions that thrive, and we can use non-Christian religions too if you want to, religions that go on something other than the smarts of the founder. No founder is smart enough to do this.
Does this model make sense to y'all? And if so, then this to me suggests a sort of possibility of resistance in doing sort of like physical but boring things as a way to create value and do meaningful stuff that might somewhat pass through the blind spots of these egregores. So just interested in thoughts on that topic.
You want to go first, Patrick, or me?
I'll be super quick. I would like to focus on one dependency that you had mentioned there that I think can assist in discovering the answer. The idea that there's no organ that can sense those type of egregore conclusions. I would propose that there is an organ in the mind that senses symbols. Just the same way that we sense temperature, that we sense sound or light, there is something in our brain that senses symbols. It is a physical organ. It's going to be either Brokaw's area or Wernicke's area, wherever, symbolic stuff. There is I mentioned this the last time I was on a STOA event. I'll bring it up now. There is a book called Genocidal Organ. It's in Japan. It's very neat stuff. But it's the idea that in sociology, in international sociology, it's considered taboo to believe in anything but that failed states are a result of bad policy. That a failed state is a result of poor decision making and not embracing Western ideas or not embracing hegemonic ideas or whichever. It is very taboo to believe that a failed state is a biological response. That is
now remember, these are, to the best of my knowledge, physicalists, and so the terrifying thought that they might have is that we have this space in all of our brains. I would assert that. I'm certainly not casting doubt on this. I would have absolutely no reason to disbelieve this, and I think it's a fascinating idea, and I think it's probably true and something worth, saying, yeah, we've got this built into us. But again, a failed state is a type of principality that is reigning. Again, as BJ said, we religious people are used to talking like this. Now, Pentecostals do quite handily, but I think Pentecostals tend to have difficulty in the lower register. But
extremely ultra taboo concept. And Genocidal Organ proposes the idea that when you are dealing with symbol collapse, when you are dealing with all versus all scenarios, when symbols no longer represent reality, the biological response is genocide.
This was a point that is like, wow, when symbols no longer represent reality, the biological response is genocide. That doesn't sound far-fetched to me.
Logical, not sociological, nothing that the academics or the wokesters or the international banking left or anything else has thrown symbols to try to pretend doesn't exist. Anybody who does military propaganda will tell you they're dancing around this exact thing. They're dancing around the idea of invoking the genocidal response of a group of people. So there is a biological element going on there. And I think if you incorporate that, it could give you a new perspective to your question.
And if you look at what we have been doing to symbols, it's a very scary thought.
I have a completely different approach to answering the question, and my approach has to do with, all right, so if we're gonna run the analogy, so that people are brain cells in a singularity that's thinking, or at least in a substrate in which singularities are competing with each other. Your brain cells don't see around each other. Your thoughts as a human do not get to see what happens between the brain cells.
What is being passed along your optic nerve is not what you imagine you are seeing right now. We know that. Can I prove it? Close one eye. Do you know I have a blind spot? Why can't you see it? It's manifest image. But cut the optic nerve, and of course, you don't see anything, or at least you don't see like we're seeing now. But the optic nerve doesn't see. Your eyeball doesn't see in the way that you're using your eyeballs to see.
They see other things. They see things that the brain cells are never going to be able to see. Right? So, because we live in a space that is out here, the brain cells live in a space that's up there. So if we go with the analogy, that egregore, yeah, it may be looking at things, but the things it's looking at are also fall into the unknowable, right? And we could not come up with a way to get the egregore to see us because we're at a different level of consciousness, right? So it makes it...
We're seeing and acting on top of all of this, not thinking about any of this, especially if it's working.
Fundamentally impossible to communicate with these things. Now, that's how far the analogy is taken to be true. I don't know. Is any of it true? I'd like to be able to figure out how to test it, right? Is there a way that we can run an experiment to determine whether there is in fact an egregore, and how would we run that experiment? That's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about now. It's like, okay, I got a cool idea. It seems relatively explanatory. Can we dig it out? Can we see? Can we test it? Can we force an egregore to undergo a behavior via some kind of experiment and have?
So I was thinking about this video, and I was chatting on Twitter with randos and people I don't know, and one of the thoughts that came up in terms of how to conceptualize this is, my kids for a while were watching this crazy anime of this city with walls and titans, and I don't want to give away any spoilers. Fascinatingly creative. And I thought about that in thinking about these egregores and the images of it. I think we need something that sort of changes our relative size with respect to what we're talking about. And of course, religion does that. Religion makes us small, and
have a hypothesis and see if it works. How do we do that? That's where the next step of this kind of discussion goes in my mind. And
oh yeah, there's this scene in Attack of the Titans where they capture a small one and they try to, and I just thought, yeah, capture one of these? No, it's the wrong way to think about all of this. You certainly try to master yourself, which is more than most of us can do. But
I don't know the answer to it yet.
Yeah, here's an interesting question. If we could get the macro portion of this solid, meaning that it's not going to put us all at existential risk, through dampening functions, through technological changes, through mechanisms that allow us to make sure that this major thing doesn't go. Would it really matter? I mean, I think our tolerance for dynamism at the low level is really low right now. I mean, we see everything as a potential threat because we know that it could just blow up and become macro. Is if we can control the macro side, we can probably control so much more dynamism, or be more tolerant of all this dynamism and crazy ideas. I mean,
and I think what he's talking about here is exactly what religion does. So, okay, Jesus has conquered the principalities and powers. Jesus has saved the world. You say, well, the world isn't saved. Right. Not yet. But the end is done. Okay, so because you can't manage that anyway. So the end is done. So now, on this level, you need to get to work with what's in front of you. Well, wait a minute, the world is a mess and it's going to crash. Yeah, but and I think what happens in religion is exactly what he's talking about there. Because then suddenly you're freed up from your anxiety, and now you can save Moscow, Idaho. Or now you can work on blessing your little church or your little corner or your little this or your little that. Now you might still have imaginations that first Moscow, then Boise, then, San Francisco. Okay, have your... most of these plans that we make don't happen. And when they do, they usually surprise the ones that they are happening to more than anyone else. But the point he's making here is exactly what I think religions do, because religions tend to secure the end and then work towards that end, hopefully without too much anxiety.
If somebody is fit at any side, big deal. I mean, 30 years ago, that kind of would have just gone over. Yeah. It's like, even if those crazy little things go wrong, as long as you get the macro right, that's a really, really, that may be a formula for a very, very dynamic society, and that we are much more creative than the one that locks everything down, from stem to stern, like China. It goes for stability over everything else. Anyway, and
it's at the layer of your symbols and your beliefs and your aspirations that you can secure the big thing. And again, you see this in Christianity. Jesus has saved the world. It's already accomplished. It is finished. There, done. Okay, now work in your little corner.
I think our tolerance for dynamism or dynamic or errant thoughts is really low right now, and we're just, it's because we're primed to think that anything can become dominant and forced on us.
And again, part of the reason why religions so often place the eschatological hopes in the next world or the afterlife is it makes you actually far more flexible. And I make this point about the resurrection all the time. Makes you far more flexible in this life so you don't have to achieve the whole thing. And Miroslav Volf makes this point. It's, again, one of these quotes that I read very regularly. Part of the problem in the breakdown of the Yugoslav Civil War is that all justice must be enacted and all retribution must be found here and now, because there is no offshoring the kind of judgment and justice and condemnation and punishment into the next life. So now you must somehow figure out how to extract out of Chairman Mao the just punishment for what he put a nation through, or out of Stalin, or out of Putin, or out of anyone that you choose. You must get them out of that biological, physical being. You can't. How can you make Chairman Mao suffer enough to pay for the sins of the Cultural Revolution? You can't. His individual body is insufficient. Religions do that kind of math, and they do it with an afterlife. And I think that's part of the reason religions keep working, because you can let God sort them out. Because when we try to sort them out, it makes for a very dark space.
If only we had institutions who could communally take on the risks we all fear, we would be free to embrace the dynamism we know exists. But alas,
if only we had institutions.
Have a networked institution now. I mean, there isn't a networked institution. To the extent that we do, it's like some standard system, but we don't even have control over that. We're just like, if we had something like that.
And this, of course, is how churches functioned at the center of their cultures. Those were the networked institutions. That's what the religions did at the center of the culture. And so again, you see China trying to take Confucianism and put it at the center. You see Putin and Dugin putting at least a version of the Orthodox faith at the center. America had establishment Protestantism at the center. France, Spain had Catholicism at the center. That's how these systems work. You need an institution. Now, figuring out how the institutions relate to each other, again, in the American system, you had the separation of church and state. And what that did was create sort of a, I've got to watch what I say here, sort of the establishment Protestantism was a spirit more than it was, let's say, something like the Roman Catholic Church. And that gave the culture an incredible amount of dynamism. It was a spirit instead of the Anglican Church in England. And that gave it dynamism. Now, the weakness is that, in a sense, it evolved into secularity, but certain agreements in secularity, which are now coming undone. And you say, well, if we had an institution that managed that, well, how's that going in France with the Roman Catholics and England with the Anglicans? So, yeah, it's tough, and this again is why I don't think just going back to the Puritans or Constantine in Constantinople is finally going to do it. Religions are far more dynamic than that. And, there wasn't Constantinople until there was Rome. And Rome was a mess.
That would at least set the standards or cook it into the minimum acceptable stack for interconnection, then I think we could relax a lot more.
Well, can I make what is the dismal end here?
Yeah.
I've been around. Like, I've been to different places. I haven't been to all places. I haven't sat inside Dugan's living room, or checked out the folks who are writing interesting books in Japan. But I've been to a lot of places, and my sense of it is that almost nobody is in a position to participate in this conversation, particularly the folks who tend to be in charge of almost everything that drives the world that we live in right now. And I don't mean that a little bit. I mean that a lot. And I've chatted with these folks. When I was like 23, I was chatting with these folks. It was going out 23, 27. I was getting concerned. That actually is somewhat important. These concepts, the adults in the room is going to be folks who we probably know, to be honest. Just be very, very frank. That's what's up. And some of the challenges that we've named, like, what does egregore design actually consist of? What does it mean to be able to create islands of sanity that are composed of human beings that are capable of actually doing things like constructing environments whereby they are particularly in relationship only with those egregores that have continuity and health? And there's that's a chunk, right? That's a thing. Here's the good news is, the flip side, this has actually been ongoing. There's stuff happening in the world that is guided by these exact notions for at least a decade. And, there are efforts to create seed pods and islands of sanity with a real recognition that it may be very much like Venice in the fall of the Roman Empire or more, with seriousness.
And that's where, I've done some appreciation of Doug Wilson more than some of you would like. I've done some criticism of Doug Wilson more than some of you would like. But Doug Wilson is actually trying in a space in the world. Now, again, this is very puritanical in not a negative sense of the word, but still in a very historical sense of the word, because if you go way back in my channel, search New Haven, Connecticut, read the history of the Puritans and what they came to America to try. Now, didn't necessarily go so well, especially with respect to some other people, and in many ways it failed, as it always will in this dispensation. I am not a postmillennial. But at least to try to do it with real people in a real space, with a real institution, with real relationships. All other theoretical stuff, it just flies up. Reality is the upper and lower register working on each other. What's the upper register? Heaven, spirit, mind. What's the lower register? Earth, flesh, matter. That's reality, where they come together. It's always, that's why early on in my conversations with John Vervaeke, I said, the two worlds mythology is not going away. It's just not going to be bottom up all the way up. That's the Tower of Babel. And what happens is you get to a point and you lose the languages and it crumbles. It's thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's the two coming together.
So, there's good news and bad news. One thing I can say for sure, definitely do not expect anything that was from the 1970s era world to have the least bit of efficacy in terms of making your life better.
Those striped bell bottoms not coming back. All right, I'm gonna call it there. I didn't when I started this, I didn't think I would end with the swarms, egregores, and autocults, but I think that actually is sort of a good way to help locate Skye Jethani and David French and Doug Wilson. So, yeah, this was pretty crazy. Didn't quite know how this video was going to go. I'm really anxious. I'm really excited to see what the comments are going to be.